Well, joining me live now is Ashraf Haidari from Colombo in Sri Lanka. He's the ambassador of Afghanistan to Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. What is your reaction to these attacks in Afghanistan?
Well, as an Afghan, I'm really speechless. Every Afghan is heartbroken. It's tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, hitting the innocent, suffering people of Afghanistan who have already been suffering for the past 40 years. And here's a situation where Afghans are desperately trying to flee in search of protection, to flee fear of persecution and very credible threats to their lives. And this suicide attack happens, and then another one following that, where the attacker opens firing into a crowd of people trying desperately to make it on one of the last flights before the upcoming deadline. And it's heartbreaking as we see that unfolding. Like the reporter just pointed out, other Afghans are equally suffering across the country, on the streets of Kabul, in the parks, without any food, shelter, water. Remember that just over the past 3 months of extremely violent offensives by the Taliban, hundreds of thousands of Afghans were driven out of their home villages, who had already been hit hard by protracted conflict and COVID-19, and as well as the adverse effects of climate change and poverty. So it is such a complex humanitarian situation where, as the reporter pointed out, the United Nations itself has been desperate trying to raise more aid resources for their 1.3 billion appeal, which unfortunately is only about 30% or so met. So you see a lot of countries in the region talk, but unfortunately not walk the talk in terms of supporting Afghanistan, in terms of now enabling a situation where an inclusive government is immediately formed, where all Afghan voices are represented, and then they are supported to move on to address this humanitarian crisis with the support of the international community. Our economy has collapsed, unfortunately. State institutions across the country were destroyed by the Taliban. Critical service delivery infrastructure were destroyed by the Taliban. And we have a dysfunctional state in Kabul, and we see the situation unfolding as it is on the hands of the Taliban, who are simply blaming it on others while they have inherited this environment, this situation, which they should be doing a lot more to ensure the protection of the Afghan people.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the concerns from our guest earlier, who said security is obviously the big fear now. And while no group has claimed responsibility for these attacks, US officials believe it is an offshoot of Daesh. What do we know about this group? And do we know if it has any relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Well, absolutely. They have at least they've been operating under the umbrella of the Taliban over the past at least 5 years. It's the permissive environment which the Taliban has provided in Afghanistan for Daesh, Al-Qaeda, ETIM, IMU, and a number of other regional and transnational terrorist groups, and as well as organized criminal groups that traffic drugs out of Afghanistan, supplying the world's massive colossal demand that has also taken place under the firm control of the Taliban, even before they were able to capture much of Afghanistan.
So how big a challenge then will it be for the Taliban to form this, what it calls an inclusive government, if there are so many other groups also vying for control?
Well, it is a challenge and also an opportunity. An opportunity there groups of Afghans, including the former President Hamid Karzai. the chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah, are still in Kabul. They've been holding meetings with the Taliban, but as well as the rest of the Afghan communities who feel threatened and frightened, assuring them that they're in talks with the Taliban, convincing them of working on an inclusive, meaningful administration which would represent all Afghans, so that they work together moving forward to stabilize Afghanistan, so that together we can prevent such terrorist attacks from happening.
One wonders whether the 20 years and the trillions of dollars spent and the lives lost by the US forces trying to go in and get rid of al-Qaeda, if that was worth it when there are other groups that will just come in and fill the vacuum.
It is very unfortunate that the United States actually went to Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11 and toppled the Taliban. And now we see, unfortunately, that the very US and NATO allies are handing over Afghanistan to this very same Taliban, which had sheltered Al-Qaeda and which is sheltering Al-Qaeda as we speak today. And this is not what I just make up. You can just go online and read the recent United Nations monitoring team report on the further growth and strengthening of Al-Qaeda, and as well as other such terrorist groups like Daesh under the umbrella of Taliban over the past 5 or 10 years. So yes, the blame rests with the United States, especially with the Biden administration, not on why they're withdrawing. That's a sovereign decision, which we have always respected. But on the very way that they've chosen to withdraw, knowing fully from their own intelligence information as well as advice of the military that a situation as we see right now, was going to happen, and unfortunately it has happened. And today's casualties also include 4 U.S. Marines, I'm sure young men and women who went to Afghanistan to support this evacuation. So all sides are losing, and that's why we, the Afghan people, encourage regional stakeholders and as well as others outside, including NATO allies, to really focus on stabilization of Afghanistan for the sake of the Afghan people. So far it has been about them, about their 4-year administrations, or about geopolitical rivalries involving stakeholders in the region and extra-regional players, and as well as also we shouldn't forget the role of the state sponsor of the Taliban, which is actually facilitated as what we have been watching.
When you say stakeholders in the region, who specifically are you talking about who could help try to stabilize the country?
Well, all member states of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that include China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and Central Asian states, most of whom directly neighbor Afghanistan, and they have a direct stake in the stabilization of Afghanistan, because they all share concern about the intertwined threats of terrorism, extremism, and drugs, which unfortunately have only grown and would further grow under the Taliban. Remember that it is the areas under the Taliban that are producing 95% of the world's drugs, and it's the Taliban under whose umbrella all these terrorist outfits have gained strength, and today even carried out this operation right under their nose.
Do you think the US should have a future role to play in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, the US must, play a constructive role. They're morally obligated to do so, not just the US, but the rest of the NATO, because of the spillover effects of what's happening in Afghanistan. Not just for the Afghan people, of course, it has never been about the Afghan people or Afghanistan, but, it has always been about others. But this time around, hopefully moving forward, everyone thinks about Afghans too, that they put Afghans this time first. If they do so, I can assure you that Afghanistan would stabilize, beginning from our own immediate neighborhood, beginning from Pakistan, beginning from Iran, beginning from China, Russia, India, Central Asia. It is in their backyard. We are in their backyard. Our destinies are intertwined. There can be no regional peace and stability without a stable and peaceful Afghanistan. So I foremost call upon them now to help us, to help respond to this humanitarian crisis, to respond to this UN appeal for humanitarian assistance, and then to move on to persuade the Taliban to form an inclusive government so that we move on about the business of putting Afghanistan back together, because they've just over the past 3 months destroyed everything that they could, from state institutions to the infrastructure, and displacing hundreds of thousands, totally 5 million Afghans, and in total about 20 million Afghans are living below the poverty line and needing immediate humanitarian assistance.
Ambassador Ashraf Haidari speaking to us there from Colombo. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us on TRT World.